Alright, welcome all to the very first little recording here related to sociology. I just want to give you a few minutes, hopefully each week here, where I talk a little bit about sociology and how it relates to the material that you'll be reviewing in the PowerPoints and in your text. Let me just say from the get-go that this does not replace reading the text. So I'm not going to cover every aspect of the text in these little presentations. I just want to kind of get you thinking about how sociology works and what sociologists are looking at. Use these kind of supplemental to the other materials, but primarily the textbook, and of course PowerPoints come in handy as well. That should be your approach moving forward. Okay, so let's just start with a basic definition of what is sociology. So let me just mention here that sociology is a discipline that really focuses on groups. Unlike our sort of sister discipline of psychology, we're the study of groups and how people interact. What makes this important is that when you're looking at groups, you may kind of sit outside and say, well, what are you talking about? What kind of groups? All groups. A group can be anything from two people sitting around chatting all the way up to our largest groups, which is a society, like the United States, which has 300 and some million members. So groups can be all kind of different sizes. And you, of course, are members of many, many groups in your daily lives. You are all a member of a family somewhere. You are students at college, which is another group that you belong to. Many of you are workers, and so you have that group you belong to. So we are impacted or influenced by the groups we belong to, and of course, we influence the groups we belong to. Just like as a family member, you influence the things and the attitudes in your own family. Just something to think about going forward. Now, when we start looking at the sociological perspective, and that means how are we looking at the world, sociologists try to really step outside and view what's going on without too much preconceived notions. One of the things that really gets in the way of sort of truly and scientifically viewing the world is what we might think of as common sense. And what I mean by that is we all, since we're members of this society, since we're members of our culture, we're part of this culture, we all tend to think we know perhaps a lot more than we actually do, myself included. So, as a scientific pursuit, of which sociology is, one of our biggest goals is to take away what we think we know and make sure that that's actually true. Sociologists, when they study the world, we really kind of try to do that. Try to look at the world as it is, not at how we might think it is, because we all work under some faulty assumptions from time to time. And I just want you to think about how sociology can impact your own life. So you see on the screen here an example of a map here. And I like to use this as an example of something sociologists call our social location. So you all know that at any given point in time, you're at some physical place. That is, you could find yourself on a map, or locate where you're at on a map at least, and you could say, okay, that's my location. Well, sociologists kind of try to do the same thing, except we don't use the term, we use a map because we're not located just on a map. We use this term social location. So where do we fit in society or amongst other people? And there's some very important measurable variables that lead to our social location. Take a look over here on the right hand side and you can see what some of those are. Things like someone's job. So if you have a job, or even if you don't have a job, that's still part of your social location. It tells you a little bit about a person who has a job and what type of job they have. Additionally, what type of income does someone have? What type of education does someone have? What's one's gender? We'll talk about gender a lot more as we get into this course. Additionally, other variables like what's your age, what's your race, ethnicity. And just to give you a feeling about how people fit in society, just imagine that I was to ask you this question. Say, I've got someone, you don't know this person, it's just someone on a piece of paper somewhere, and say, I've got someone who makes um, $2 million a year. Could you begin to take educated guesses at some of those other variables up there? So, if you know they make $2 million a year, could you take an educated guess on, for example, job? I bet you can. And I bet that the first thing that doesn't come to your mind, at least, is probably a person working the counter at McDonald's or Walmart. And you say that's probably not going to be it. There's very few careers out there that offer that type of income, $2 million a year. So, what may have come into your mind is a business owner, maybe a professional athlete, um, maybe a CEO of a large company. This is going to be someone who has a particular type of job in general who makes $2 million a year. You could also probably, there's certainly exceptions here, but you could also probably guess that someone making that much money has a fair amount of education. That is, they probably have more than a high school diploma. Now, of course, if you're thinking of someone like LeBron James, that wouldn't be true. But the vast majority of people making that kind of money probably have a fair amount of education. They probably have perhaps at least a bachelor's degree, maybe a master's degree, maybe even a doctorate in their particular field. Um, we can also make some guesses on things like gender and age, and perhaps even on race ethnicity. Now, if we know all of these things about an individual, that would be our social location. So, just something that we think about as sociologists and where we all fit in society. And you might want to ask yourself, where do you fit in society? And some of these things, of course, we can change. Each one of you are in here because you're changing at least education, and I'm assuming changing education for many of you because you want it to lead to higher income. So, some things can't change, of course. We don't have control over age or race or gender for the most part, but some things do change. So, I just wanted to kind of bring that idea up. Now, I'm going to zoom through here, um, and I really want to spend just a little bit of time here on the sociological imagination. Um, this is a famous American sociologist. His name was C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills. And he came up with this concept that he called the sociological imagination. And what C. Wright Mills basically said was the sociological imagination is how you should be looking at the world. It's how you should be evaluating what goes on around you. And there's really two parts of this sociological imagination. The first part is what he called history, and the second part is what he called biography. Now, most Americans inherently are good at this second part right here, this biography part. And and this is the way that we tend to view the world. That is, when something happens out there, when you see some story on the news or you see something going on, people say, how does that affect me? That's the biography part, right? How does that affect me? What does that mean to me? So I think of this when we see a lot of the debates going on about budgets and about the role of government. And people will say things like, "Oh, I think we have too much debt in this country. I think that's a bad thing," which is very possibly true. Um, and people start saying, "Well, how does that affect me? How would those problems affect me?" And people start thinking about their future and will they have Social Security? Will they have Medicare? Will they have Medicaid? Those types of things. So, that's an example of how you kind of naturally look at the world using this biography standpoint and say, how does it affect me? But what C. Wright Mills said was, that's good. That should be a part of the way you view the world. But he said the other part that's often missing is this part right here, this history part. And what Mills was arguing there, saying, was that um, we must look at ourselves in the big picture of things. And he doesn't mean history like facts and dates and Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That's not the history he's talking about. The history he's talking about is sort of the big trends that go on in society, right? What's happening that's big. And this is what oftentimes people don't see. This is what people kind of don't open their eyes to. And so, for example, looking at something historically from C. Wright Mills's take, we might look at how technology has sort of overtaken the world. Now, um, most people carry around little computers in their pockets. We call them smartphones. And people are now more connected, and they can text people and phone people and get on the internet anytime they want, perhaps. And maybe many of you do that. This is a sort of historical change. That is, it's related to changes that happen in society. And oftentimes people don't do a good job stepping back and trying to sort of see how these changes occurred. So, your goal really here this semester is to develop this sociological imagination where you look at the world not only through your own story, your biography, but you look at how society is affected by the big things that are going on, by the big trends that are going on in the world. So this is how our goal is to put that history and biography together. So I just wanted to kind of give you a heads up on that. That's really our goal by the end of the semester. All right. So I wanted to show you one more thing before I take you out of here. And I use these in class, so I'm not going to go through every single one on here. But I did want to mention sort of where sociology came from. So one of the sort of foundations of sociology. I mean, we can trace sociology back even further than this. I mean, um, if perhaps the most basic question related to sociology that one could ask is, what is a good society? What's society look like that works? What's government look like that's effective? What's it mean to live in a good society? Those are certainly important questions that people have been asking for thousands of years. Now, what differs is sociology really develops in the late 1700s into the early 1800s. And sociology itself develops as, and this is what makes it different from the way old days, like the ancient Greeks and Romans, in that we are the scientific study of society and social interaction. Right? So we are the scientific study. So the social sciences don't develop until the late 1700s, early 1800s. So we are looking at these things scientifically. Well, how did it come about? I mean, how did someone sit around and say, hey, maybe we should study society scientifically? Well, the big thing that happened here is that we had the Industrial Revolution, another one of those big historical trends that C. Wright Mills would have talked about. And in the Industrial Revolution, we had all these new factories being started. I mean, we eventually had water power and then steam power. And so people who had for most of history been farmers, right? Most people farmed by far. Started moving to the cities, started moving to these more urban areas in order to get jobs in these new factories. Now, sounded great in principle. I mean, it sounds like an awesome thing. Get off the farm, move to the city. We think nowadays of the city as the place where things happen. All kind of things happen. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. But for these people, it was really sort of interesting. They said, well, let's go into the city, and they needed less and less farmers because there was more technology, and so people started moving to these places. Now, you might be familiar with what actually happened when this happened, because as people started moving to these areas, it was not all sunshine and flowers. What we actually saw was that these places were kind of nasty and dirty, and in many parts of the world, including Europe, England, for example, people didn't have running water, they didn't have running sewer, which meant that people just put their waste right out the window, and it would collect on the roads until a big rain would come and wash it somewhere into some river somewhere. So it was pretty nasty, dirty environments. I mean, it was really sort of rough. And you may be familiar with this time era because the famous writer Charles Dickens is writing in this era. And Charles Dickens, famously, you probably know him at least from A Christmas Carol, right, with Scrooge. But you sort of started to see how society wasn't all peaches and cream. In fact, it was dangerous. And in many of these places, children, of course, just like they'd always worked on farms, when they moved to the city, parents put their children to work in the factories. And these factories were very dangerous. This was before we had regulation. It was before, we had OSHA. If you've been in the workforce, and so what happened is many kids were getting injured and killed. A lot of diseases were spreading around these cities, so it wasn't a really nice time to be alive in. Well, um, this really made the early sociologists, the people who started sociology, they really started questioning what was going on in the world around them. Why did this happen? This was supposed to be progress, right? I mean, this was supposed to be better, moving off of the farms and moving to the cities. And for many, many people, that clearly wasn't the case. So why did it happen? And so the early sociologists, those founders of sociology, really started to question this, and they started to look at what had happened and exploring the world scientifically. And thus we got sociology. So I'm going to leave it here for this very first lesson. So be sure you're reading through the chapter one. Also, be sure that you're looking at all of the resources that are provided for you in the course. But I do want to mention one more thing. Um, those three sort of most important people, early sociologists, that you're going to hear over and over in this course were three guys. I say guys because they were all men in this case. Was One was named Emil Durkheim, one was named Max Weber, and one was named Karl Marx. So we're going to talk about them. In fact, I'll talk about them in the next little lecture I do here, next little segment I give you. But they are the people who end up really sort of being, they weren't the exact first sociologists, but they were very early and they were the most important ones. In fact, so important that some of us now call them the Big Three. Just like the big three car companies we used to have, the big three sociologists. So they're long dead now, but their work still impacts all of us sociologists today. So I'll talk about them next lesson. So let me throw in another reminder here since this is the first one. Please be sure that you go into that Start Here folder and you have your syllabus there, you have your course schedule there, and those two things you definitely want to have printed out so you have something to refer to. That course schedule, if you haven't seen it, and I don't know if I can pull it up here, see if I'm actually in a course. The course schedule, if you haven't actually seen it, is pretty great, and it can really solve a lot of problems for you. So it's here listed under class schedule in that Start Here folder. But if you open that up, what you're actually going to see, and this isn't exactly the one, it may change a little bit, so don't try to use a screenshot here. But what you see is that it gives you what is due each week, it gives you the due date, it gives you quizzes, discussions, assignments. They're all listed on there. And so if I were you, what would be really helpful is to print this off. It fits all on one page. Go ahead and print this off, put it right next to your computer, and that way you'll never ever ever miss an assignment or a quiz or a test or anything, because you'll know exactly when they're due. And that's really important because there is no makeup in this course, so it's flexible. You can complete this material kind of on your own schedule, but kind of, because there are due dates and those due dates are not flexible. So you want to be sure that you get those assignments done by the due date listed, because once that date passes, those assignments will lock out. You will not have access to them. So that's just a little heads up. I'd hate to see you get behind by not paying attention to the schedule. And so, like I said, print this off, have it next to your computer, and you'll be good to go. You'll be good to go. All right. So welcome to the class. My name is Chris Biedenbach. You can call me Chris. You can call me Professor B. You can call me Mr. B. All of those work. And I look forward to a great semester. All right. Have a good one.